Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Gia, and I'm a board member here at NAMI Maryland. I will be the moderator for our webinar today. The impact of responding to high-stress environments on a daily basis and the experience of trauma can take a toll on first responders throughout the course of their careers. Today, we are hosting Lieutenant Richard Goerling and Chief Jennifer Tejada, who will introduce a growth mindset and mindfulness skills aimed at supporting first responder health, humanity, and performance. We will also be exploring attitudes and skills that support the ability for first responders to thrive through adversity while discovering their own wisdom in adopting strategies for recovery, flexibility, and momentum towards sustained post-traumatic growth. Before we get started, we just wanted to note a few housekeeping points. To avoid background noise, all participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar. We'll be addressing questions at the end of the webinar. If you have any questions as the webinar continues, please enter them into the questions box, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen if viewing from a computer, or at the bottom of your screen if viewing from a phone. We will be reviewing questions as they come in, and if something in particular is unclear or needs to be explained, we will ask our speakers to do so when the question is asked. If you have any comments or concerns during the webinar, please also enter these into the questions box. We will review and address any immediate needs as they occur. A recording of this webinar will be emailed to each registrant tomorrow. The recording will also be available on our website at www.namimd.org for any individuals that were unable to register. 1 hour of CEUs are available for Maryland Police, Corrections, and EMS professionals. Individuals pursuing CEUs must attend the whole webinar and submit the survey that will be presented to you at the end of today's webinar. A certificate of attendance will be sent to each registered participant tomorrow afternoon. After the webinar today, you will be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved, and what you would like to see in future webinars. Each person that completes the survey will also be entered into a drawing to win a $25 Amazon gift card. We plan to continue hosting educational webinars, and we ask that you please fill out the survey to let us know how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. I'd like to now welcome our speakers for today's webinar, Lieutenant Richard Goerling and Chief Jennifer Tejada. Lieutenant Richard Goerling is a certified mindfulness trainer, retired police officer, and veteran who believes in our innate resilience, humanity, and capacity to show up, serve others, and thrive amidst hard circumstances. Through the Mindfulness Badge Initiative, Richard specialized in training health, humanity, and human performance skills to first responders and other high reliability professionals. One of Richard's current projects is being trained alongside a therapy canine named Buddha, who trains alongside others to bring joy and mindfulness skills to responders and veterans. Richard is an affiliate professor in the School of Graduate Psychology at Pacific University, conducting research on mindfulness and policing, and an adjunct professor at Portland State University in the Criminal Justice Program teaching ethical leadership. Chief Jennifer Tejada began her law enforcement career in 1995 as an officer with the Novato Police Department in California. In 1996, she established a sexual assault prevention program for young women in Novato. A year later, she was appointed to the California Advisory Commission on Sexual Assault Victim Services. Over the next 14 years, she worked her way up the ranks to captain and became the highest ranking female officer in Marin County. In 2011, she was appointed chief of the Sausalito Police Department, where she served for 4 years. In 2015, Tejada was appointed as the first female chief of the Emeryville Police Department. Her tenure as chief was notable for a strong focus on community-driven policing, juvenile justice reform, and officer wellness. Her other areas of expertise include threat management, emergency and disaster preparedness, workplace violence prevention, domestic violence, and sexual assault prevention, and hostage negotiation. In 2020, Chief Tejada retired from policing. She has served on several violence prevention and victim services committees, boards, and commissions in California, and served as vice chair of the legislative committee for the California Police Chiefs Association. She holds a BS in anthropology from the University of California, Berkeley, and an MS in law enforcement and public safety leadership from San Diego University. Thank you both for joining today, and we'll turn it over to Lieutenant Goerling.
Thank you, Gia. Appreciate the great introduction there. You know, one of the words that you used was wisdom, and really what we're talking about today is the intersection of science and wisdom, and that wisdom really is internal. And so what we're going to be visiting around is this idea of how do we tap into the wisdom that's innate to our own human being. And so to do that, we're going to talk about growth mindset and mindfulness. And let's just get started here. Really quickly, I want to share with you this is kind of a bit misplaced right now to talk about equanimity. However, as we talk about the ethos of service as a first responder, or really in service to anyone, in any kind of role that we have where we're in service to other humans, this idea of equanimity comes from the science and the wisdom that I just referred to. And I'm going to revisit this slide when we're finished, and it may make some more sense to you. But I think one of the things that's really critically important for us to consider is the ethos from which we serve as first responders. And, you know, we talk about health, humanity, and human performance. This is where those three things intersect. And if we don't have a solid foundation for our ethos, for why we wake in the morning and go to work in service to others, then it's going to be really difficult to hold that ethos and to hold the necessary health and humanity to show up with that ethos. And this notion of equanimity is offered as a way of shaping your ethos of service to others as a first responder. So I'll leave that alone for now, and I want to move into this thing called mindfulness. Carl Jung is an infamous psychologist, philosopher, scientist, and I love this quote. He said nearly 75, maybe more years ago, he said, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. One thing we've noted in studying first responder health is we easily disconnect from our own experience and from the body in particular. We get trauma injured and that trauma lives in our body, and we maladapt in ways to move away from the consciousness of what we're experiencing in the body. And so in psychological research, we refer to this as aversion, right? Or experiential avoidance. We want to avoid the experience of discomfort, which of course, right? That makes sense. Yet when it's maladaptive avoidance, it causes problems. So what we're doing with mindfulness skills training is we're shining a light on maybe some things that we've not paid much attention to in order to have new choices, new possibilities, new opportunities for informed choices about how we care for ourselves and how we show up in the world. So this is a slide about first responder stress, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time talking about the data. So let me just leave this slide up and talk a little bit about what do we know about what I refer to as the landscape of suffering. First responders are suffering. The data are telling us that we just simply are not able to hold our health at a baseline to sustain a healthy level of mind and body through the arc of our career. And so what we're seeing is we're seeing all kinds of interesting research that's emerging, whether it's in policing or fire service or emergency medicine, and then other places around that first responder community, that are telling us that our people that are in these service roles are not doing well. And, you know, we could provide PowerPoint slide after PowerPoint slide about this is what a brain imaging looks like on stress, and here's some diagrams of stress. And rather than make this a science class, which, you know, is an important thing to understand, but we don't have the time, nor do I think the impact is very good with talking about the structures of stress and how it shows up in your brain and your body and all of that. What we really need to understand is that we have a lot of work to do. And there's study after study that tell us that we're not well. First responders are not well. And we could look to, for example, we could look to something called metabolic disorder, which is a kind of a conflagration of a number of different kinds of diseases, illnesses that come together, and first responders are at high risk for metabolic disorder. So that looks like cardiovascular disease, it looks like stroke, it looks like heart attack. And we unpack those things, we start to see dysregulated stress hormone levels like cortisol. We start to see dysregulated blood pressure. We start to see obesity. We see pre-diabetes or actually diabetes. And a lot of these things may in fact be part of our genetic programming as individuals, yet they're exacerbated and even accelerated by chronic and acute stress on the job. And so there's no question that we really need to look at first responder health and also take a look at a large body of scientific evidence that gives us a path forward. And it's this path forward that's really interesting. This path forward is actually a path inward. It's a path of attention and compassion training called mindfulness, combined with an attitude called growth mindset, which allow us to become skillful in this trauma profession, whatever that is, as a first responder. And so we're going to move into a little bit more of that. Again, some more data around sleep. We know that first responders suffer from greater clinical depression, from sleep problems, and from fatigue. You know, fatigue just simply from shift work is a major problem. There's a group of researchers, one of whom is up at Oregon Health Science University, Oregon's medical school, where I'm from, who in 2011, so it's 10 years ago, they published an article in the Journal of American Medical Association. They stopped just short of calling first responder fatigue, chronic fatigue, a public health epidemic. And I wish they would have nudged it over that line, because what we know is that chronic fatigue creates all kinds of potential for illness within the body, but maybe equally important and related to public health, more important, is that chronic fatigue creates the possibility, the probability, the likelihood of cognitive failure in the field. And so y'all know this, you know that when you're tired, when you're chronically fatigued, you may not think with the kind of clarity that you'd think with if you were well rested, right? And so to address those issues is one of the greatest problems we're facing in our public safety world, in the United States and Canada, really all over the globe. Okay, I'm gonna skip the slide on trauma. So let's talk about stress injury formation. I'm gonna skip this slide too, just because we have some things here that we have limited time and I want to get to some questions. So how we think about stress matters. And I'm going to talk a little bit later in depth about a growth mindset and a fixed mindset. But I just want to introduce this idea that our perspective about stress is critically important. There's a researcher out of Stanford, Kelly McGonigal, who wrote a book actually called The Upside of Stress, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, did a great TED Talk. She's I don't know, I'd call her a stress psychologist, maybe. It's probably not terribly accurate. But in her TED Talk and in her book, she writes about and talks about how we see stress, how we think about stress really makes a difference. And I think that as an industry, as a first responder, as a public safety industry, and this even goes beyond public safety, we have a lot of drama around trauma and a lot of drama around stress. And rather than really diving into what stress really is and how to get good at it, we really train ourselves to try to avoid it. I'm sure you've heard of the term stress management. Well, one of the things I'm here to suggest is that stress management is a fallacy. We spend a lot of energy, cognitive and physical, trying to manage stressors on the job, and it doesn't work. The data doesn't support that it works, nor does the wisdom of the lived experience tell us that it works. And we get that wisdom of the lived experience from, interviews of first responders. What do they tell us? And so how we think about stress matters. And this is going to be really important as we move into this notion of growth mindset. So one thing that is really kind of interesting is that in 2011, Rand Corporation, think tank down in Santa Monica, they published a study that looked at promoting psychological resiliency in the United States military. And one interesting thing is that we had, my team at Pacific University, we had an opportunity to have a conversation with one of their researchers. And we're on the phone and, we're talking with a researcher and they told us this. They said, we looked at, for example, the Navy and Marine Corps' combat operational stress reduction training. And he said as a training, it was fantastic. From an instructional technology standpoint, the training couldn't have been better. So the problem is it didn't work. And by work, he meant that it didn't change the behavior of the Marines and sailors who were trained in this combat operational stress reduction training. And he said, so what we realized was that we were training from the neck up. We were training just cognition. So we were training just ideas, just information, and we weren't attaching skills that actually promoted psychological resilience. And so we had some further conversation with them, shared some of the things we were doing, and they wrote this report, they published this report in 2011. Which I think is really relevant. And one of the things they said was that there's 5 key individual level factors that promote resilience. And the first 3 you can see are in blue, and there's a reason for that, because the first 3 are what we get when we train mindfulness. So let's talk about that. Interoceptive and emotional awareness and regulation. This is key. This is what we're going to be talking more about. Well, how do you do that? But interoceptive is really what's going on in my body, literally in my body. Can I be really in tune with my experience of being in this remarkable human machine that I've been gifted with, right? And so that's the first piece. And not only being aware of it, but can I regulate it? Even when it's uncomfortable, can I regulate what's happening in this body of mine? Self-efficacy and self-compassion. Self-efficacy is also called agency in the research. It's a sense of being able to have some internal locus of control over the world around me, in addition to self-compassion. So agency and self-compassion are critical, and we're going to talk about both of those things. Psychological flexibility. Now, we're not going to spend a whole lot of time talking about psychological or cognitive flexibility, but we'll touch on it briefly beginning right here. What we're really doing here is, again, remember Jung's comment, right? Until we make the unconscious conscious. The more data we have, the more clarity of processing, sense-making that data, the more possibility we have of making sound or informed decisions. So those first 3, and then healthy coping, which often comes from those first 3, and physical activity movement. We're going to talk about that as well. Okay, so as we look at first responders, we look at what are we doing for stress management. Now, this is a study that looks at law enforcement. And frankly, there hasn't been a lot of meta-analysis in other industries. But this is true probably in every service, whether it's fire or emergency medicine or whatever it is in the first responder world. But a meta-analysis, they looked at all these different stress management interventions in these organizations across the United States, and they concluded insufficient evidence exists to demonstrate that these are effective. All right, so this is similar to the outcomes that Rand Corporation got when they looked at some of these stress management interventions. So really what we're saying here is it's time to pivot. It's time to really shift what we're doing and to think differently, and to train differently. And what we're proposing here is an entire shift in our mindset. It's in a shift of, we don't need to talk about stress continuum. We don't have time for that. But a shift in how we view occupational stress and trauma. And it begins with this. It begins with a growth mindset. And so I'm just going to ask everybody to take a really deep, intentional breath right now. Because this might be a little challenging, because what I'm proposing here is counter to much of the culture in which we've been trained as first responders. So let me first describe what a fixed mindset looks like. A fixed mindset says that stress happens to me. So stress happens to me. I'm a first responder. I need to armor up and survive stress and trauma. And if I do get injured, then I'm broken and I need fixing. And so much of our institutional response to stress injury, to trauma injury, to occupational trauma, really more broadly, is from this fixed mindset. And it is not serving us well. And in fact, this mindset is slowly causing more suffering, and maybe not slowly in some cases. And so a growth mindset is different. A growth mindset says that I experience occupational stress and trauma. Moreover, a growth mindset says that I chose this profession. I chose this profession for a reason that's motivated by my desire to have purpose and meaning, to be in service to others. And I know I will be exposed to human suffering, right? So again, a growth mindset says I chose this profession and I know I will be exposed to human suffering. And I know I will be trauma injured over the course of my career, right? And I can skillfully move through this trauma. I can operate in my trade craft. I can navigate my own informed decisions towards interventions, which we'll talk about here shortly. So it's a difference in how we see stress. And so where does this fixed mindset, growth mindset come from? So it comes from a researcher at Stanford named Carol Dweck. And Carol and her team have been studying mindset for a long time. And she wrote a book called Mindset, which you might find interesting. It doesn't talk about this necessarily, but what we've done is we've operationalized Dweck and her team's work on mindset and applied it to occupational stress and trauma for the first responder. And this is what it looks like. Is this fixed mindset over here, which is where the industry has been, which is not working well. And it's this growth mindset over here that is a new way of seeing and experiencing and being in occupational stress and trauma. So the other thing that goes with this is critically important, is that what the data tell us and what the wisdom of the lived experience tell us is that you will be stress injured over the arc of your career. You're going to experience stress injury. We might call that trauma. We might call that trauma injury. It's going to happen. Now, there may be a single-digit percentage of first responders that have exceptionally blessed, gifted genetics that won't experience this. But the rest of us mere mortals are going to be trauma injured. So let's train for it. Let's train for that trauma before it happens and after it happens, so that we can be more skillful in it, and then we can be more skillful as we move through it towards recovery and towards something called post-traumatic growth. And so post-traumatic growth is not some guarantee that I'm going to end up stronger than I was when I started, yet it is a possibility. And in the 1970s, when researchers were, psychiatrists, not just researchers, but psychiatrists, psychologists were working with Vietnam veterans returning from war, one of the phenomena they experienced was in a certain number of veterans was that they actually came through the recovery, through the healing, through the growth process. They came out stronger than before they shipped off to Vietnam. And this became a really interesting point of research, and it's been researched quite a bit since then. And much of our stress management training talks about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a very real and a very serious issue that some of us may have to navigate, right? And still, we can set the conditions for post-traumatic growth. We can set conditions to move through trauma injury, right? Making informed decisions, working with interventions, which we'll talk about more specifically here in a moment, to set conditions for post-traumatic growth. And we've seen this human phenomenon across generations where people experience great suffering and they move through it and they emerge with wisdom, with some strength. And we still may carry the scars. There's no question we'll still carry the scars of the trauma. But they can possibly make us stronger. So what does this mean? It just simply means that there's hope to be able to move through stress injury. And it's also, it's data, it's evidence that tell us that it's okay that I'm stress injured, because the fixed mindset suggests there's something wrong with me when I'm stress injured. And we can't possibly be in a trauma profession and not be impacted in some way by trauma. Okay. So let's talk about these interventions. So growth mindset, one of the pieces of that was with interventions, I can move towards recovery and healing and set conditions for post-traumatic growth. So this is what we mean by interventions. First is integrated medicine. So having an integrated medicine team, ideally, right, that we visit. So we're seeing our medical doctor on a regular basis. What does regular mean? Well, that's up to you to decide. I'd say probably at least a year, and then more frequently as issues come up that you need to manage with your medical team, right? This also means not just, you know, an integrated medicine doctor. It might mean visiting with your naturopath, your chiropractor, acupuncturist, your needle person, right? Yeah, for some reason, that's a tough word for me this morning. So there's lots of other options aside from historically, you know, Western medicine approaches. So integrated medicine is critically important. The other one is mental health coaching or psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is often perceived as something for when we get injured, and we often have the stigma around it that it's a weakness. Well, what the data are telling us and what the wisdom of the lived experience are telling us is that psychotherapy is both preventive and it's a response to an injury. It's critically important. One of my conclusions as a researcher, as a retired responder, is it's critically important for all of us to have a psychotherapist or a mental health coach that we see on a regular basis. Again, regular is relative, just simply to navigate the challenges of the work itself. And then when we're injured, to use that as a part of our intervention strategy towards recovery and growth. Social connection is another intervention. So intentionally pursuing social connection. One of the things that we see with first responders is when they get trauma injured is a tendency to isolate. And that tendency to isolate exacerbates the injury. And we're just simply wired as humans to connect with others. So intentionally pursuing social connection. And that looks like a lot of different things that I'm not going to really dive into because in the interest of time, I'll move on. The other intervention is the pursuit of spirit, awe, adventure, and joy. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it might mean a faith practice for some people who have a particular faith that they practice. It might just mean going to theater, right, when we can, when COVID's not restricting that. And yeah, going to see, you know, the latest Marvel comic movie, but also going to see, you know, Cirque du Soleil and other just remarkable things that people do, the symphony, the, you know, that country music band or the rock band or whatever, but just enjoying the arts, because this is where we find the experience of awe. The other experience, we find awe in adventure and joy, just getting out and playing intentionally. And again, a lot of times what we hear from first responders is they stop doing the things that they love that bring them joy. It's therapy. Meditation. Mindfulness and compassion meditation are interventions to trauma injury. Movement, integrated fitness might be another way to say this. Pretty self-explanatory, I think. And then gratitude practice. Gratitude is an attitude of gratitude, okay? And so these are just some of the interventions, and frankly, this list keeps getting longer. But interventions are really nothing more than actions toward, right? As we begin to cultivate greater awareness of what we're experiencing, we make more informed decisions around actions, around a intervention plan to move toward healing, recovery, and set conditions for post-traumatic growth. And these are also preventive. They're not exclusively in response to injury. Okay, so now we talked about growth mindset, we talked about interventions, let's talk about mindfulness. And so, yeah, what is mindfulness? You know, there's a lot of different definitions of mindfulness. Here in the United States, John Kabat-Zinn, who was at University of Massachusetts Medical School, really brought what we might consider secular mindfulness and sort of grounded it in a training program that he titled in the late 70s, mindfulness-based stress reduction. And since mindfulness-based stress reduction has gone on, you know, globally, and it's the dominant mindfulness training, I think, here in the United States. And John would define mindfulness as really simply just paying attention on purpose. Paying attention on purpose. And maybe we might add, you know, without the sort of analytical judgment that comes along with noticing what we're experiencing. So we'll just keep the definition really simple and let's talk about the sort of the tactical reality of what is mindfulness. So mindfulness is about training attention and it's about training compassion. But first, let's talk about attention. We're training three kinds of attention. We're training active attention, passive attention, and meta attention. So you know these things as focus, as mind wandering, and situational awareness. We're really just training attention, and we use this thing called meditation to train our attention. And we bring these qualities of mindfulness as we bring attention to something, we bring this open curiosity. Like, can we just be curious about what we're experiencing? And this is difficult. This is not an easy task. Can we also accept what we're experiencing? But it's not acceptance in defeat, it's acceptance with action. This idea of non-judgment, which sometimes is the most difficult working with first responders, as we pay attention to ourselves and to the world around us, we're working with this notion of non-judgment. So what we're trying to do is take in data. That's really what we're doing, right? We're taking in data from our senses. We're taking in data from instant interoception, from what's going on in my own body. We're being curious about it. We're accepting what's there because, you know, likely it is what it is, right? It's our experience in this moment. Now we can shift it in the future. But one thing that we often do is we have this inner narrative that runs full of criticism and judgment. And can we just pay attention to that too and find if there's any discernment and just let the judgment sit? So wise discernment is critically important. It's the judgments, the analytical judgments that may not serve us well. And the final quality that we really bring to our attention practice is compassion. Because as we pay attention to ourselves, we're going to notice things that are probably uncomfortable. And to be able to do that, to be able to bring these qualities of curiosity, acceptance, and non-judgment requires some compassion. And it requires compassion for ourselves. And from that self-compassion, we cultivate greater compassion for other people, which is a skill which we're going to talk about. And here we go. So compassion, again, mindfulness is training attention and compassion. And these two skill sets are critically important. And we often have this idea of compassion, you know, so now we're talking about, you know, rainbows and unicorns and lollipops. No, we're actually not. We're talking about fierce application of science and wisdom. And so over the last 6 or 7 years, my team of trainers, we've come up with a way of describing compassion that's operational. And this is the operational framework for compassion that we offer you. And we think this is a quality of our relationship. So compassion is a skill. First of all, it's a skill, right? It can be enhanced and it can erode. And it's a quality of our relationship to our own and to other people's suffering. And we achieve this quality of relationship by training a set of skills. And the first one this is really where it begins, is the awareness of body, awareness of feelings, emotions, thoughts, and patterns. And so it's self-awareness is where compassion begins. Self-compassion feeds that awareness and feeds the ability for us to sit in that awareness of what we're experiencing. Distress tolerance, meditation sometimes feels good. Sometimes, oh man, it felt really great. Most of the time, especially for first responders, meditation is a practice of distress tolerance. It's uncomfortable. It's kind of agitating, right? Because what are we asking you to do in meditation? We're asking you as a first responder, hey, come sit in stillness with me and pay attention to your thoughts. Like, who wants to do that, right? Come pay attention to what you're feeling in your body. Come pay attention to your emotion. Well, I've been running away from those things just because they're uncomfortable. And now you want me to come sit with them? Yeah. Why? Well, because you're a badass. That's why. And we can get good at sitting with those things that are uncomfortable. So we're cultivating distress tolerance. Boundary maintenance. Okay, so this is important in a number of ways, right? We also define compassion as fierce, kind, and holds boundaries. So there's certain boundaries we have, social boundaries, right? Even professional boundaries of, hey, guess what? You don't get to kick the medic when we're doing this, or you don't get to fight with cops. You don't get to harm other people, right? Those boundaries, but our own boundaries too. So there are times when we're training in distress tolerance where we may want to get up and walk away. So sometimes meditation, boundary maintenance is, okay, I've meditated for 10 minutes and I just got to stop. Okay, great, right? So we have our own boundaries. We make our own choices about really caring for ourselves, and that's part of the boundary maintenance. It's also this cognitive empathy, which is, I see that you're suffering and I'm here to do something about that suffering. So this cognitive empathy, but it's a desire to understand the causes and conditions. And when we have a desire to understand the causes and conditions, for example, understanding the causes and conditions as best we can of the opioid overdose epidemic, right? And looking at, okay, what does it take to get to substance abuse disorder? And it's not just a simple choice people make, which is one of the things we do as first responders to try to put some distance between that suffering and our own, right? Is we create judgments and labels and terms that really, frankly, other people, said differently, we have a coping mechanism, maladaptive, of dehumanizing others so that we can protect ourselves in some way. Okay, and when we bring compassion as described by these qualities, we're able to understand the causes and conditions, and maybe we're less likely to others. And finally, it's a reflection on altruism, on meaning, on mission and purpose, and what it means to be in service to others. So we're training attention and compassion in these domains, and we're training in our physical body. We're paying attention to our physical body. We're paying attention to our thinking mind, our thoughts and emotions, and they're intimately connected, and also to affect and feeling states, neurosensations, heart rate, respiration, perspiration, all those other sorts of things. Those are internal domains of awareness. And external domains of awareness is situational awareness. So we're training mindfulness to become more skillful at taking in data in our landscape, situational awareness. We're also training mindfulness to become more attuned to other human beings. So in the mindful meditation practice, we have something referred to as the mindful attention cycle. And we bring our attention to our breath, for example, and immediately we're going to get distracted by something. Our minds are constantly working. There's things going on. And so meditation isn't about just clearing the mind and focusing on one thing. It's really about focusing on one thing, which might be the breath, and then getting distracted and noticing, oh, that's interesting, I'm being distracted. I need to go check that email or whatever it is. And then remembering to come back to your focus on your breath. And we do that over and over and over again. Okay, I'm gonna skip the obstacles. I'm gonna skip the cool brain scans. And let's just do a really short meditation practice. So the invitation is to sit with a nice tall spine, maybe even put your feet flat on the floor, relax your shoulders, relax the jaw. We tend to tighten that up, relax the muscles around the eyes. And you can keep your eyes open for this or close your eyes. It's entirely up to you. And just start by taking a few deeper breaths than normal. You can breathe in through your nose or mouth, whatever. It really doesn't matter. We don't need to overthink breathing. Your body knows how to breathe. Just deep in breaths and out breaths. And when you're ready, allowing your breathing to find its natural rhythm. And the invitation is to bring the focus of your attention just to the gentle rise and fall of the belly as you breathe in and out. So as you breathe in, just noticing the sensation of the belly rising. It would be slightly. And as you breathe out, notice the sensation of the belly slightly falling. You can even expand that awareness from the belly to the chest and noticing the chest expand and contract as you breathe. And all we're doing here is just noticing the physical sensation that accompanies the in-breath and the out-breath. And undoubtedly, your minds are wandering. Maybe there's questions emerging like, why am I doing this? Maybe there's judgments emerging. Oh, this is silly. Yeah, of course, all these things are going to happen. You're going to start thinking about work you need to do this afternoon or things you haven't done that you wanted to do, or all kinds of distractions are going to emerge as we just simply sit here, taking a deep breath periodically and just noticing the rise and fall of the belly as we breathe in and out. Sitting in stillness, noticing the breath. The invitation now is to take a couple of really intentionally deep breaths. So breathing in really deeply. Get to the very top of that in breath. See if you can breathe in just a little bit more. And then pivot the breath, exhale, exhaling fully. When you get to the bottom of the reach of that out breath, see if you can breathe out just a little bit more. And then allowing your breathing to find its natural rhythm. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes or resume your favorite, most comfortable position, and we'll finish this really short awareness practice. So what we just did, we did this attention practice, right? We sat in stillness, we paid attention to the breath. And that's just a really sort of a easy mindfulness practice. It may not have felt so easy, but there's power in this seemingly benign practice of attention of the breath. Okay, so we could talk about some research outcomes, and maybe I will briefly touch base here. So there's 2 universities right now that have been doing research on mindfulness with first responders. Actually, there's 3. University of Miami, Amishi Jha, neuroscientist down there who's been training with fire service. University of Wisconsin-Madison, Dan Group and his team there have been training mindfulness with police officers. And Pacific University in Oregon, where I'm at, we've been training mindfulness around police officers and a little bit of fire service. We have partners too, University of New Mexico, Oregon Health Science University, and others. Over the last 10 years, we have learned that mindfulness skills training improves the health and the resilience of first responders. And so what we see in outcomes of training is a reduction in self-reported stress. This is both operational stress, so out in the field, and it's administrative stress, okay? The kind of stress that, you know, Chief Tejada and I would cause people, right? As, you know, leaders in an organization. Pain. We see improvements in our relationship to pain. and our ability to work with pain. Now, pain doesn't necessarily get reduced. It doesn't, oh, it's like mindfulness is not some sort of magic thing of, oh, my pain's gone. But what we're doing with mindfulness training, what we're doing with these skills of attention and compassion is we're changing our relationship. One might even suggest we're transforming our relationship with the stress around us and inside us. And so as the relationship changes with stress and pain, we begin to see improvements in our ability to cope with those things. We also see improvements in sleep, improvements with we'll say, less alcohol use, and in many cases, it's less alcohol misuse. We see improvements in compassion and empathy, improvements with cortisol regulation, improvements with reductions, rather, in symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, and reductions of inflammation in the body. And so these are just some of the outcomes that we see with mindfulness skills training among first responders. So we've moved well beyond that mindfulness is some sort of woo-woo thing, it's some sort of hippy-dippy thing, where that argument is so old, it just does nothing but harm us right now. We look at what does the science tell us about health and resilience and human performance, and we train skills that will get us there. Mindfulness skills training is that pathway forward, and the research is suggesting it, and the wisdom of the lived experience as we interview people who've trained in mindfulness, and we find out what their experience is. I'm going to skip some of these slides and just kind of maybe cut to the end because I want to talk about questions. I want to see what questions are emerging. And we can come back to some of these slides if we need to. But really, I want to get to the very end here. As you can see, there's a lot of things to talk about and so little time. Emotions are one of my favorite things to talk about. There's a lot of misunderstanding of what emotion is, and it's really causing us a lot of harm operationally. So really the key takeaways is that we can change our narrative around occupational stress and trauma by adopting and training a growth mindset. And it's much more than just going, oh, I have a growth mindset now. We have to train the growth mindset. This is a shift. This is a major thinking habit shift, and it takes some time to shift. Okay, mindfulness is an organic, foundational organic technology that helps us to adopt a growth mindset and helps us to navigate stress injury. So we know stress injury will happen, so let's train before the trauma. And interventions are mandatory, right? So it's not just a growth mindset, it's growth mindset with interventions. Remember those: integrated health and psychotherapy and social connection, et cetera. And really, at the end of the day, what we're saying is that training skills and awareness and compassion are, in fact, the gateway to our optimal self and our optimal human performance. And I'll pause here and see if there's questions that have emerged, or we probably have some questions we can address. And Chief Tejada, any gaps you want to fill from my talk here?
I think that was wonderful, Richard. You captured, I think, all of the salient points that need to be shared on this topic. I would just emphasize that, you know, our profession, the profession of first responders, particularly law enforcement, you know, we are trained to be hypervigilant at all times. We are I think I heard the term killology is sort of a mindset that is often sought out by, you know, police trainers to create this person who is on constant alert and looking at the world through the lens of fear. It's a sort of a fear-based existence, and, you know, a year, 2 years, years of that results in cumulative, you know, stress-related health issues. And, you know, to really look at what Richard is saying is that our training, the substance, the nature of our training needs to change, and we need to incorporate this growth mindset and this move away from fear-based existence to an existence that is present in, awareness of self, awareness of emotions, not fearing emotions, but saying, yeah, I am scared out of my wits going into this domestic violence call, and that's okay. I can take my breath. I can bring my cognitive acuity online versus operating from, the amygdala, and I'll be okay. And then, when we combine this training of awareness of self with compassion and the extension of compassion training, we have a much better resourced first responder to deal with all of the events of a day in the life of a responder. And I would offer that in the context of what is happening today, that what Richard is delivering is the missing gap in reform in police training to forge a way ahead to optimal performance for our first responders. It really is, it is, I believe, the missing link in our approach to the issues today of police performance.
Well, thank you all so much for all of this critical information. We will open up to questions now from the audience, which can be placed into the questions box at the right-hand side of the screen if viewing from a computer, or the bottom of the screen if viewing from a phone. And I guess to get us started, I mean, you both talked about just the way people have been trained historically in this field and how it hasn't included this kind of work. And why do you think the field has been so hard to change this culture? And specifically for Chief Tejada, someone is asking that if they wanted to be certified as a mindfulness trainer, how can they earn this certification?
I'll start, and then Richard can certainly answer this question. Why is it so hard to change our culture? I spent 10 years as a police chief trying to do that. And there are many, many reasons why it is hard to change the police culture, as it is with any organization or profession. But, we're paramilitary, and we have omitted, we've left out the care of the human behind the badge. And I think that's why we've dehumanized our profession in many ways. We have really, from the basic training of an officer, to deny him or herself an emotional response to situations. You end up having, somebody who's like very, very seldom will raise their hand and say, I need some psychological help. I am stressed out. I have depression. I'm drinking way too much. My marriage is on the rocks. You're not gonna have that. You have a damaged profession, damaged people in the profession who, just the culture is not there to accept this and to make the necessary adjustments. But to answer the question on, I'm actually not certified as a mindfulness trainer. I'm a mindfulness coach for first responders, and that is through a program that Richard and Mindful Badge offers.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, to become a certified mindfulness trainer, I would point you to the International Mindfulness Teachers Association. That's imta.org. You can get more information there. It's kind of a long journey. You can also email me if you want, richard@mindfulbadge.com, and we can get more specific depending on your background. My organization, we do run a peer coach training that's for first responders. So we take the first responder who has had some foundational training and move them through a pretty intense, 4 to 6 month training program where they end up with the skills necessary to coach mindfulness and to go back to the organization and to do things like this, to do seminars, webinars, and other foundational trainings. The other thing I wanted to kind of follow up with what Chief had to say, one of the things I'm convinced, and I've been studying trauma in the first responder world for 17 years, both as a practitioner and as a researcher, and I'm convinced that dysregulated, the key is dysregulated, fear, anger, and ego are the primary forces that create suffering from let's say from the police officer or the medic or the firefighter to the community. And that looks like a lot of things. In policing, we know it looks like often use of force. It looks like other kinds of things as well, just interaction. And fear, anger, and ego are not bad things. They're necessary. They're part of the human experience. And what we're doing with mindfulness skills training is that we're teaching first responders how to be with fear so that fear becomes an ally, as Jennifer was saying, how to be with anger so that anger becomes an ally, and anger and fear and ego as well. These things don't become the dysregulated tail that wags the dog. They become part of our performance, part of our state of flow that allow us to take in data, make sense of it clearly, vet our own judgments that emerge, and take the discernment, the wise discernment that comes from our training, our experience, and to take informed actions to operate within the tradecraft that we're trained in and to serve the community. And the culture of policing, for example, why is it so hard to shift? We are not evidence-based. We hold on to a distorted warrior ethos. And this is why I offered you this notion of equanimity. This notion of ethos, and call it warrior, call it guardian, call it whatever you need to call it. However, it's what drives us as we come to work day in and day out. And it doesn't mean that we can't be super skillful in what we're doing, but we can be grounded in awareness and compassion and show up in service to others in ways that make us accessible and not ways that create barriers, which is one of the key issues in not just policing, but primarily policing in America right now, as well as the cognitive failures that result from all kinds of cultural influenced and self-dysregulation and extremist ideologies. Let's face that as well.
Great, thank you. Another audience question is, how do you think these issues affect first responders after retirement? And why do you believe that many first responders die 5 years after retirement?
I'll hop in here in the silence. Here's my hypothesis, okay? And there's not enough research around this, but my hypothesis is this, is that first responders live in that fixed mindset throughout their entire career. And they hold it in, they hold trauma, they mask trauma, and they don't address it. And they retire, and then they don't have a place to go every day where they're in states of hyper arousal neurophysiologically, which allows them to mask the trauma. And then so that switch is turned off, and then they have to face decades of occupational trauma that they didn't address during the actual acquiring of it. And it becomes almost a catastrophic reckoning. And that may take years, 5, 6, 7, 10 years. I don't know that we're still seeing the same kind of mortality data post-retirement. I do think the needle is shifting, but I don't know for sure how much of the needle is shifting. But if you think about it, you think about the culture of the first responders to be strong for everybody. We're not addressing our own injuries. We retire, and guess what? We have to come front and center with them. Or we keep maladapting, and then we accelerate the demise of those duty-related illnesses and injuries, and they may actually shorten our life as well.
I would just add to that the profession, you mentioned earlier on, Richard, about the suit of cultural armor, this armor we put on and all of the emotions stuffed inside. And then the profession, forces us to identify as a police officer, right? And officers tend to congregate together after work, outside of work, and because of this mindset of, we've always got to be on guard, we can't be trusting of others outside of the profession, socializing happens within that demographic. And so when retirement comes, what was our identity is now gone, and the human behind the badge is sort of left stripped of that. And I think therein lies some of the complexity of what happens after retirement is, you know, we haven't taken care of that human behind the badge. We haven't allowed that person to be whole, to have that equanimity that Richard speaks of. And it's just a recipe for, you know, just negative outcomes.
Thank you. And we have time for one more audience question, and this one is around threat of livelihood. And the question is so the person saying the main obstacle that I've found getting people to seek help is threat of livelihood. And the question is, what post-critical incident stress retreats have you worked with?
Can you repeat the question?
So it says threat of livelihood is the main obstacle I've found getting people to seek help. What post-critical incident stress retreats have you worked with?
I think the question is about, if I raise my hand as an officer and say, I need help, is my job in jeopardy? And I think, you know, in many cases, the culture supports that fear that if I say I'm having, you know, a mental health breakdown, that, yeah, my job is in jeopardy. And I call upon the leadership of law enforcement to make it okay to raise my hand and say, I need help. And it doesn't have to be career ending, but in many cases, that still happens. And it really is, you know, incumbent upon leaders to make it okay to say, I need help. And then for the second part of the question, in California, we have the West Coast Trauma Center, which is a place where some first responders are lucky to attend a week-long retreat to help recover from the ills of this profession.
Yeah, so there's a retreat center there on the West Coast that Chief's referring to, and there's another one on the East Coast. There's probably more than those two, and they're fantastic. Here's my concern. My concern is that as an institution of first responders, we're waiting until someone needs a very significant intervention post-trauma injury. So what we're saying is, let's shift the culture. Let's adopt a growth mindset. Let's understand that what the data tell us is that you will, as a first responder, be trauma injured. So let's address that. Let's train more smartly. Let's get rid of some of these nonsense ideas like killology, which is just incredibly harmful. And let's get more skillful at using force if we're talking about policing. But let's use force because it's necessary, not because we're dysregulated in fear, anger, and ego. Let's get more skillful at working with the severe kinds of suffering that we're seeing as first responders in a society that desperately needs some investment in its social infrastructure. You know, so we will always need the sort of the post-trauma interventions, but the prevention is front and center, and it's largely being ignored.
Thank you so much for those insights, and thank you everyone for joining us. This webinar has been recorded and will be emailed to registrants tomorrow. The webinar will also be uploaded to our website at www.namimaryland.org for any individuals who are unable to register for the webinar today. We hope that this webinar has been helpful for you this afternoon. At the end of the webinar today, you'll be asked to complete a short survey on the aspects of this webinar that you felt were helpful, could be improved, and what you would like to see in future webinars. 1 hour of CEUs are available for Maryland Police, Corrections, and EMS professionals. Individuals pursuing CEUs must submit this survey. You'll also be entered into that $25 Amazon gift card drawing. We plan to continue hosting sessions, and the survey will help determine how NAMI Maryland can best support you during this time. By being an attendee of this webinar, you are also invited to join us for our NAMI Walks Your Way Maryland campaign. NAMI Walks is the nation's largest and most successful mental health awareness and fundraising campaign. NAMI Maryland has been involved in NAMI Walks since the very beginning, and we invite you to join us for what will be no doubt an incredible virtual experience. There are many ways you can make a difference with NAMI Walks as a sponsor, team captain, team member, or individual participant. However you participate, you'll be joining a national movement to reduce stigma, spread awareness, and support NAMI's mission here in our state. You can join now for free at www.namiwalks.org/Maryland. We wish you all a safe and healthy rest of your week, and please do not hesitate to reach out to us through our website or by phone at 410-884-8691 should you need additional resources or support. Have a great rest of your day.